My name is Jennifer Tugenye. Today is February 18, 2023. I'm here with Meron as part of the Chicago Youth Movement's Oral History Project. Meron, thank you so much for being with us. Can I record this interview, please?
Yeah.
Perfect. Meron, let's just start out with you telling me about your childhood, family.
Yeah, so I was born in Ethiopia, and I lived there for a couple of years, and then me and my family all moved to Kenya together, and we also lived there for a few years, and then we eventually moved to the US when I was about 8 years old. I have a family of six with four siblings, including myself.
Awesome. So you described moving to from different countries to another. Um, did you resettle to Chicago specifically? And like what neighborhoods did you live in and how did you get there?
Yeah, so me and my family moved straight away to Chicago. We did have foundation of family that we wanted to be close to coming into a big country too. Um, and I believe we lived in another small community, but I don't remember it that much. The one I do remember the most, and like obviously the most fond of, is the one I'm currently in, which is Uptown. It's like a very vibrant and diverse community, has like so many people from all walks of lives, and like obviously so many immigrant populations. There's a huge Asian American community, and that's like a lot of family businesses around, a lot of festivals we have up in town, especially like in the summers. So it's a really fun environment to be in. There's a lot of youth groups, so like you always see youth up and about. I've also been involved with working a few of them, and it's a really great place to be and live in.
So just to give context, Uptown is a community or like in the city, where is it located?
Yeah, it's a little bit on the like northeast side of Chicago. It used to be actually the downtown of Chicago, so it's shifted as downtown has shifted down a little bit. Um, there have been a lot of changes to it. It's become so diverse and it has like a deep history that it has with specifically with Chicago as a whole.
Okay, so it's a neighborhood. Could you talk about your educational journey um throughout your childhood?
Yeah, so I obviously moving, I've been to a lot of schools. The ones that I do remember the most are, I think, here in America, where I started off in a CPS school, and for most of the first 2 years I was here, that was my idea of like the education system in the US. But then eventually I moved to a private school, which is a very big jump in like the way I was taught, also like the students that I was around. It was a very predominantly white school, um, and I think that kind of shaped the way the way I was thinking, how I was viewing things. It was from that lens. And moving on after I finished eighth grade, there was like I was excited to be a part of a high school that was diverse in my eyes. So as Northside, it was a CPS public school. So I was excited to be like, from students all over the city. And I was very excited to go to such a school like that. But once we entered, I had a very interesting view of it because it wasn't as diverse as you would expect, especially for Black students. I think I expected it to be a lot more diverse, where administration was also very like diverse, and also the teachers were, but it still wasn't diverse enough. But that was my view of schools here.
That's interesting. So you mentioned three different school communities. Could you tell me a bit about the first school that you went to, like the name, the location, how far it was from where you're living?
Yeah, so the first school that I talked about was Haight Elementary. And at the time from where we were living, it was a good 15-minute walk from my house. It wasn't too far. It was very accessible for the students that went there. And then the second school was the private school that I talked about was Sacred Heart. It wasn't too far from my house, but we did need transportation. So I did have my parents dropping me off and picking me up every day. Um, and then the high school that I'm currently at is a bit of a drive from our house. I do take public transportation majority of the time, so that's about a 35-minute bus drive to and school.
Okay. So could you describe your current school community?
Yeah, so that's the high school that I talked about. Um, it
Just
I've
with the
had
name address, with the name, location, neighborhood.
Okay. So my school is called Northside College Prep, and it's about, like I said, a 35-minute bus drive from my house. It's in the north side of Chicago. Um, and the north side community is actually one that I've had a few troubles with. It is a very diverse school inherently when you look at like the population of different races and different ethnicities that are there. But as a Black student, I haven't really felt represented in the school. There isn't that big of a Black student percentage. And even when you look at the percentage of teachers, that one is also very low. So I've had a very interesting relationship with my school community.
Interesting. Could you speak more about I guess, the dynamics that exist among students in your school when you talk about diversity, right? Um, and I'm curious to learn more about what the dynamics are between students.
Yeah, I think the best way to describe it is our school is very separated. I feel like a lot of the either the friend groups that you'll find or even the clubs and organizations are very diverse, are very separated within themselves. So I think a lot of students stick with each other rather than us having, interconnected like spaces in the school themselves. So it feels very separated from each other, and you feel like you're connected to one group rather than to the whole school in itself. And I think a lot of the way the school administration works and the way our teachers operate, I think enables that behavior. And it's something that I've seen for all 4 years of Northside.
Interesting. You talked about how the school has people from all over the city. Could you talk a bit about that, and what it was like to enter the school?
Yeah, so the way CPS works is that it has a tier system. So Northside, being a selective enrollment school, has the ability to gather students from a lot of different areas. Even though the tier system in itself isn't the best policy, it does bring students from a lot of areas of the city, and that way you kind of just learn so much more about other people and their different like walks of life, obviously. And so, but this does affect like how students get here, the transportation efforts that it takes, and also just how they're able to be in their classrooms as well.
Thank you for sharing that about selective enrollment system in Chicago. So to transition a bit and talk about your organizing, and you did mention being part of different youth groups. Could you tell me about how you got involved in community organizing and what your perceptions were of those spaces?
Yeah, I think the very first time that I was involved was as a freshman in high school. Um, my current youth leader, who I've worked I've worked with for all 4 years, is actually the first person that introduced me to the space. Where she did visit my school for, I think, a phone book event, and I ended up exchanging information with her, and she invited me to a micro internship that she was holding over the summer, which was really like the first step for a youth who wanted to be involved in such a space to really learn about what organizing was and the things they could do with it and how specifically youth can be such an important part of it. So I think that was my first view of organizing in itself and like being in a space that was focused on activism, especially from the lens of youth. And I think that is exactly like what shaped my perspective of it and how it really should function and how I've operated throughout my entire 4 years of working in this. So that was really the first introduction that I had of organizing spaces.
Yeah. Could you describe what a youth leader is, who the person was, and um the event that you met at?
Yeah, so um, our youth organizer or our youth leader is really the person who not like leads the entire discussions or our meetings, but really brings ideas to the youth there And we kind of all just sit around and bounce each ideas off of each other. And she helps really just cultivate the space that we're around and help us flourish and like learn from each other and share our experiences. My youth leader was Chris Aldana, and she was really great. I think she made the space that we were in feel like almost like a family that we were in rather than just like it being a workspace or like it didn't feel like I was in a classroom at all even. Um, and I think the event that I met her at was a phone book event that Northside was having with one of our student organizations. It was, I think, a school club. I can't remember the name, but we were trying to phone book politicians for a certain act that we wanted them to get behind. And we were just calling people, letting them know about it, and pushing them to call their representatives or aldermans or whoever it was so that we could get them involved in the organizing. And the whole point was to get people around us and people in the community to know about these events and to focus on that. So that's where I met her. And I think a lot of the work that we did also revolved around the event that I met her at.
Thank you for sharing. Could you talk about your first the feelings and initial perceptions you had going into this space and how those perceptions may have changed if they did?
Yeah. I think I was a little intimidated at first. I think it was like very much a role I didn't think youth would be like, involved in. It felt like a huge thing that, you're trying to bring change to a certain community that affects so many people. And I think before I was part of the micro internship, I felt like, oh, I don't know enough to be a part of, such works or to even try to push for something because I've we're told so many times you're a youth, you need to learn all these things. Eventually you'll get to a place where you can bring about change. So I think my initial perspective was like, oh, this is like a lot of intimidating work and this is something that will be hard to accomplish. And I think with all the other youth that I worked with and with Chris, my youth leader, it was something that slowly changed. And it was like, what, this is really something that in the end of the day like involves me as well and it impacts me as well. So I definitely have like the right to be involved in making changes and to push for what me and my community want, especially when we have leaders who aren't listening to us. So
That's awesome. Could you describe the micro internship, what it is, what you were learning,
yeah,
and
so
the day to day of going to that?
mhm. So this was around COVID. So it was very much something that I think Chris put together in a time where we weren't able to go out and about. So it was a virtual, I think, 8-week internship where we were able to really on a daily basis, we would come and we did have, I remember one activity that it was like draw a river map of your experiences and how like you'd hope your river to continue. So I think it was a lot of experiences or a lot of it, activities that learned we learned about each other first, and we were able to like create that community feel to begin with. And then moving on, we had a lot of workshops from Chris about organizing or about just Chicago history on its own and all the like the many things that have happened and the things that we hope to change. And we kind of really set goals for ourselves as organizers. So I think recently we went over those goals that we made, I think a long time ago. It was 4 years ago. And it was kind of like, so have we accomplished these goals that we wanted to do? And it was like personally as an organizer, not, oh, I want to enact this act. It was really like, as an organizer, I want to find like my purpose in organizing or why I organized to begin with. So those were like, it was really building the foundation of what we want to do as organizers.
So, what were some of the things that you guys were hoping to accomplish, and what issues were you trying to focus on?
So I think in the micro internship, I did focus on just being more aware of the spaces that I was in and trying to understand the different dynamics that were impacting a lot of things. And that's something I was able to do, especially with my school community. I think that led to a lot of the things that I was pushing for, And a lot of the things that I was involved with within my school was trying to change those things and try to fulfill that, like, these are things that I see are wrong in our school, and this is what I think they should be. So I was able to really learn that, and that was a personal goal I had for myself. But as a youth group in whole, we did work on the Teach Act, and I think that that was an act that was specifically in getting Asian American studies taught in all the schools across Illinois. It was a very big act that we worked on. It took a lot of our time, and we as youth in the section. So it was a really big project that was across a lot of youth organizations. But as Kinetic, our youth group, we were focused on reaching out to youth in Chicago who would be impacted by this Teach Act and who weren't seeing themselves represented in their textbooks, and how so we would have workshops where we would invite teens, invite other youths to come, and we would ask really just like, how do you see yourself represented in your education system, and how would you like to see yourself represented in the education system? And it was very much based on like, we wanted to focus on, after the Teach Act is passed, how do we get this implemented in schools? And we focused on how we would have workshops for teachers to really learn about the history that they were going to teach eventually, and how we could get students to really realize this is something that I need to be learning, and how to hold their teachers accountable and hold their schools accountable. So our focus was really on the, after the act was passed, how we implement this and make sure that this is something that occurs in our schools.
Thank you for that example. Was that kind of the big purpose of the group moving
Yeah.
after the micro internship, or do you guys have other issues that you are also working on?
So that was, I think that was almost 2 years ago. But recently, after the internship, our biggest goal was cops out of CPS. It was, I think it was a big deal revolving about the Black Lives Matter movement. It was something that, as a space, we decided that was something we wanted to focus on. And there was a lot of organizations in the Chicago area that we were connected to that were also working on that. And so we did take on that role. We did have like workshop information sessions to just let people know about, this is the things that we need to focus on. We did do a little bit of people's budget, which was focusing on our Chicago's budget, which is decided by our mayor, and how that budget wasn't really representing the communities that, and what the communities wanted. So with People's Budget and Kinetic together, we worked on trying to work out a new budget for a lot of different places in the city, because we did realize that different cities needed different sections in the city needed different things. So with them too, we also worked on that.
Interesting. So could you tell me a bit more about like the specific work that you guys were doing in these campaigns, right? So you were trying to advocate for making a difference and trying to make that change, but what are the specific things that you were doing, for example, with the people's budget?
Yeah, so specifically for People's Budget, um, me and another youth organizer that I was working with, is we were focusing on our uptown areas. We talked about, as this was like the community that we're living in, so we wanted to represent those community members. We went out and we collected polls of what people thought our budget looked like currently and how they would like it to look. And we kind of gave them a breakdown of what really our budget looked like. And from that, we took what our community members wanted to see in that budget. We wrote a proposal. And then we reached out to our aldermen. And in our ward, we have the one alderman who we reached out to, and we're like, hey, this is what our constituents want to see in our budget. And as our representative, we would like you to look at these concerns, and we'd like you to review this. But we did have a lot of difficulty with reaching to our alderman. It was difficult to hold a meeting with him. So we did have to work around this and try to get his attention. We did end up holding Facebook Live with him involved. We did have asking him a lot of questions. And initially the bottom line was, will you support this budget that we have created, or will you support the budget that increases affordable housing and decreases police funding, because this is what our community members wanted to see. And so that was really like the day-to-day work that we did in people's budget. And eventually the budget was passed with a lot of our initial ideas not included. So after that happened, we did continue working with reaching out to the aldermen and being like, this is what we wanted to see, but it wasn't reflected. And so how can we keep working with you to improve that in the later times?
Interesting. So you mentioned that there's more funding for police than community members wanted. Um, I'm curious, how do you feel that the People's Budget project was connected to your work on Cops Out CPS, or how those movements were interconnected?
Yeah, I think people's budget really, it was a stark difference that a lot of community members didn't see. It was like there's so much money going into police funding that wasn't going into affordable housing, that wasn't going into mental health resources, where community members saw that and felt that difference. And with Cop Out CPS, that connected very well, because these were institutions that were getting so much money, but we weren't seeing a positive effect in our communities. This wasn't an institution that was bringing the change that we needed. And I think that pushed for our idea was, we need to defund the police and fund these other institutions, because this is what our community members need. And so I think those two institutions were those two like causes were intertwined, because the effect of this one needed to improve the other ones, were like they just worked together, and it was necessary for us to work together and make those changes.
Interesting. So were you working on those two projects at the same time, or were you working on one campaign and then went on to the other?
So I worked first with Cops Out CPS, and I think that was around sophomore year of my high school. I worked out with Cops Out CPS, and it was mostly centered on um, Cops Out CPS and getting SROs out of my high school, and also advocating for other high schools to get SROs out of their schools. And then after that is when I moved into People's Budget, which was, I think, almost a 6-7 month difference between the two.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I guess thinking about Cops Out CPS, could you tell me more about the experience of working on your school specific community?
Yeah, so I think initially when I started working Cops Out CPS, I wasn't connected to my school first. It was really like, this is something that we are working on as a whole city. And with my youth group, it was something that we just wanted to spread the news, get this out there. But eventually it shifted into understanding these are actually officers in our own schools. And I saw that in my school too. And so we realized this was really something that was also centered around the spaces that I was in. And this led to working with our LSC, which is our local student council. And there's really just a space that is with the principal, a space with parents, and obviously community volunteer members. So in this space, they really have the ability to bring these changes. So our initial step was reaching out to them, expressing our concerns as students and as youth organizers with, I believe I also worked with another student organizer who was part of the LSC. So she helped in getting this to them and letting them know our concerns. And from that, it led to this getting to our principal, us expressing our concerns to her, having meetings with her. And this led to a vote that took place in an LSC meeting where students were able to input their opinions. It was like students who weren't even involved in organizing, who just went to our school, wanted to share their opinions. And eventually we're able to vote the SROs out of our schools.
That's great to hear. I'm curious if you could talk about your relationship with SROs before getting involved in Cops Out CPS, since you mentioned having them in your school, and then kind of what the changes were in your school after the vote?
Yeah, I think for me, I didn't have a personal experience with the SROs, especially since I was just a freshman around this time. It wasn't I wasn't too familiar with the school environment yet, but I think that is also what signaled that they weren't really bringing importance to our school. They weren't really present in our school environments. We saw them maybe once or twice a week, and it was usually just like a cop car that was like sitting outside, and occasionally you just see like an SRO walking around. But um, I think it wasn't something that I saw and I felt safe in the school. It wasn't something that I don't think any of my like friends or anything were like, oh, the SROs are here. We feel a lot safer. So I think the way I looked at it was this wasn't really an added benefit to our school, and it didn't bring safety to other students either. And I don't have personal narratives of this, but I have heard of like students who were arrested during lunch by SROs, and it was something that I just thought we didn't really need in our school.
So what during the LSC, the local school council vote session, what was the reception from the school administrator, teacher representative, and community volunteers, and how was that session in general?
Yeah. I think it was really disheartening because our our biggest opposition during that meeting was the school principal. Um, Administration in general wasn't really cooperative with us on this in this movement. They were really the ones that were holding back our progress. As I think I remember specifically like in the vote, our principal and like the administration in general had cut down the student speaking time, where they wanted to vote ahead of the student like ahead of students like giving their opinions, which really didn't make sense because the whole point of this is students wanted to give their feedback and wanted their vote and their opinions to be represented in the vote. So I think that was the biggest like, I don't think our administration is really here to support us. They were really against us. And it was an overwhelming, like, it wasn't just a small student population that wanted to see this change. It was something they saw overwhelmingly in the huge student population. It was a really big turnout in that meeting as well of students that were there to speak and who wanted their voices heard. So I think that was our biggest like shock. It was, oh, our administration isn't backing us up here. And then in addition to that, there were many questions that students asked our principal was, can you please explain to us like what the SROs do and what is their purpose in our school? And we couldn't really get a straight answer out of her. And it felt like our ideas were correct, but the administration wasn't willing to back us up on this. So I think that was the most disheartening thing in the event.
Well, that must be very frustrating to have experienced. I'm curious, after the successful vote to remove SROs from your school specifically, what were your experiences in school? Did you feel safer? And what are kind of the different measures that the school takes having removed SROs?
Yeah. I think the biggest change was obviously we did have COVID. So for about a year we were remote and we weren't able to see like an immediate change or shift in that. But coming back junior year, it was I think that the first thing that I noticed was we did random backpack checkings, or it was like randomly the security like became involved in a lot of like the safety measures that were taken. So it was very much like security was involved in the disciplining of students more than the administration itself, which was very interesting for us. And we do have like still to this day it was like a security guard stands outside and randomly picks a student that they decide that they're going to check, and the students like entire backpack is searched, their water is like tested, so like you have to the like security guard like smells the water, and then you have to walk through a metal detector. So I think that was like the biggest change where it was like, okay, we didn't used to do this before when SROs were there, But SROs also didn't do this themselves. It wasn't something they were doing. But after that shift, now our security guards are checking bags, and they're like in cafeteria during lunches. They're disciplining the students during lunches, or they're like, they're the ones who are staying late at night when students are like in clubs and anything. So I felt like the roles that SROs were given were implemented onto security, but in a more stricter way.
That's interesting to hear. Um, I guess I'm curious then, like throughout, so after you were engaged with the local school council to remove SROs from Northside, could you describe kind of the next steps of your organizing? Was that, yeah.
Yeah, so I think after SROs were moved, I became a lot more involved in my school community because I realized, like, okay, this is something that took so much work to improve, but yet I see so many other things that I would like to change in our school community. So that led into like me being a lot more involved in like CPS organizing and pushing for changes within CPS itself. And I think that's something my CPS leader also helped me a lot with. I also became involved in my LSC and also a student voice committee that was created within our school to bring changes about the school. Um, but as a youth group overall, we did go into the Teach Act, and this is something that I think took up a lot more of our time.
Okay, that's interesting. Um, so you talked about getting more involved with CPS and making changes. What are the kinds of changes that
Yeah,
you
so we did focus on, I think the former group before us in the youth group was working on ESL and having allowing students who weren't English speakers taking it as a language rather than having to take a world language and an ESL class. So we did focus on seeing or trying to quantify like the actual changes that we saw or if the act itself was being implemented. So we did do a lot of surveys, a lot of workshops to try and see like what the changes were, or even if these changes helped the students themselves. So our work was really focused on, yeah, this act passed, but now let's see the effect of the act, or if it even is being implemented to begin with. And this
Mhm.
was also something that we did with African American histories. I think even in ourselves, like I think as a youth group one day we talked about what have we learned in African American history since I think an act was passed a while back to enforce this. And it was like, oh, this is what the act implemented and what it said needs to be done. But we found that a lot of us weren't even learning the things that were involved in the act. So it was very much going over like, okay, after an act is passed, there still have to be people that go and enforce it. And how do we go about enforcing this?
Interesting. I guess I'm curious when with throughout all of this organizing to push CPS, your school, um, the city or the police department to make changes, how do you feel like it it impacted your relationship with the education system in the city?
I think I think when I very first started, it was very much I was looking at my curriculums and what I was learning. And I was like, oh, this is different. This from what I'm learning from my activism, a lot of this seems very wrong. And I'm not getting a full picture of everything. And that was my initial reaction to everything. It was like, okay, my curriculum isn't really the best, or my curriculum isn't as broad as it can be. And that was my initial perspective of things, especially in like my social science classes. I was questioning a lot more of the things that we were learning. But as I shifted into my organizing and I learned more and more, it turned into I'm realizing all these things that I'm reading in textbooks, and what is really missing in my textbooks is in the space around me. It's in my school community. These problems that I'm seeing are very much a part of the spaces that I'm in. And so that led into my like relationship with my school itself and with my administration and even the students in my schools. It was really just like these problems are everywhere around me, and I want to do a lot more to change it. So that led to me being involved in student voice committee, where we were like just, a group of students who teachers and students really think can improve the space around us, and we focus on like the racial problems in our schools or mental health advocacy in the school itself, or just like LGBTQ rights in our schools. So is I became more involved in spaces where I can bring about the changes that I was initially seeing in textbooks, but I was like, oh no, this is all around me. So yeah.
That's interesting. How do you feel like your relationship was shaped by doing this work? So your relationship with the school or with the education system while you were doing this work?
Yeah, I think it became a lot more distrustful, I think almost. It was a little it was impacted, I think, a lot more as I got more into my work. It was really like this place isn't the best for everyone else. It isn't as like schools really go around being like we have a great environment, a very positive environment, but as I was learning more and more and I was in the spaces more, it didn't feel like that was the environment that I was in. So I think it became more distrustful where it was trouble working with administration where they always felt like they were against students rather than working with the students. So I think that's where my relationship was just a little uncomfortable with the school.
Mm. How does this compare to your relationship with the city and its different departments, including the police department and its political leaders?
Yeah, I think when we talk about like city, my initial thought goes to CPS and how like CPS is really just a citywide like organization that works with such a wide range of schools, but it's really just their board or their education board in Chicago is really just like 10 individuals or a bunch of individuals that are chosen by our mayor. And it's not representative. These aren't people that are voted for by the people that they impact. So I think that was like the first time I was like, this doesn't make sense because how do you make decisions for a lot of these students and so many of these families that are part of CPS, but you weren't voted on. You were chosen by a person, a mayor who also doesn't represent her constituents either. So I think that was the initial thing. And when we talk about cops, I think so much of what was going on around COVID and just SROs itself and the Black Lives Matter movement, it was very much like I don't feel safe in this city. I'd rather, especially like in Uptown, when we see so many cops around certain places, there's always like a corner that there's cops, and then you try to avoid that corner. So it didn't feel like it was adding safety to our lives, but it was more of a risk. I avoid certain places because I know there are a bunch of cops around there, or I drive slower in certain places because I don't want to get stopped. So I think those are like the relationships that I've I've had in these spaces.
Mm. Do you think that you had those kinds of perceptions before your organizing as well, or is it something that your organizing has shifted and shaped?
Oh yeah, for sure. I don't think I even as when I was going to CPS school, as when I first got here, I didn't even have an idea of what CPS was, or I just knew that this is the school that I'm in. It's a public school and it's accessible to everyone. That was kind of my like idea of everything, and it was really like, oh, CPS is a great thing because this is something for everyone. And I think for cops, even I didn't have any idea of it. I didn't think it wasn't something that was affecting my life, and it didn't feel like, oh, these are like cops and they aren't necessarily the best for our communities. And I think as I learned more in organizing, I realized this dynamic doesn't really make sense, or this dynamic isn't the safest for us.
Mm. Do you get the impression that other organizers in your group, Kinetic, also had similar experiences and encounters, both with CPS and CPD? I know you mentioned you went to a selective enrollment school. Were most of the members of your group also in those kinds of schools located in the North Side? and with similar backgrounds?
Oh no, I think our kinetic group was very diverse in the like the dynamic or racial ethnicities also, but even the different schools that we went to. I went to North Side, but we had a community member that went to another school like that was in I think in the West Side, and we had students that went to Lane Tech. So we did have like a wide range of ideas, and it wasn't just like, oh, in my school, or like we all go to this school in the north and this is our experience, and we didn't like reflect that into the whole city of Chicago. We had many instances where, I had a perspective of CPS, but in a different part of the city or in a different school, that perspective was completely different. So I think our kinetic allowed us to like see those differences, and that's when that makes you like see the differences in how schools in the north are affected and how schools in the west and the south are affected. So it was very different, and I think they had very different experiences, and how I had very different experiences in my schools. But that's what really allowed us to be able to work together and come up with like something that was beneficial for all our schools.
Could you give me an example of different experiences shared among members in the group?
Yeah, I think one I could point out is SROs on their own. I think, like I mentioned before, SROs, in my perspective or in Northside, weren't as present or weren't really an impact to the community. It was very much, it felt like they weren't a necessity because of that. But to someone else in my youth group, SROs were directly impacting the safety of students. They were in schools where SROs were present at all times, and it felt like they were there enforcing disciplinary rather than the administration to enforce disciplinary action. So for them, like it was a very different presence of SROs, where for me, it was the lack of presence of SROs in our schools where we didn't feel the need for them. But in their school, it was, this is a matter of our safety.
Did you feel like it wasn't a matter of safety in your school, and more just there's no need for them, so let's get rid of them, versus in other schools, SROs actually endangered students' safety, just to clarify?
Yeah, I think so. For me personally, I felt like it was a lack of necessity in our school, and a lot of the student opinions that were given during our meeting with the LSC was, we don't see these SROs in our schools. We don't see the need for them. But as the movement went for getting SROs out of CPS, it was very much like we have seen SROs physically like put students in danger. We have seen them affect like the actual relationship students have with the administration and the SROs themselves. So I think it was a very different dynamic of schools maybe in the north and in the the like in the north side of Chicago versus schools in the west and the south side of Chicago.
What are specific like narratives you've heard from other students in your group and across the city about SROs endangering them? Like what in what ways?
Yeah, I think it went viral around this time when we were working with trying to get SROs out of schools. Was we had SROs like putting disciplinary actions that you would regularly see a principal or an administration enacting, where SROs were arresting students or SROs were hitting students, and those were like the narratives that we were getting of SROs elsewhere, and to us it was a very different perspective that we had. So those were like the ideas that affected how we worked in cops at CPS and getting SROs out of our schools.
Okay. And then could you tell me about you're talking about having people from very different schools, sides of the city, and experiences being in these youth organizing spaces with you. I'm curious if you could tell me about what community building looked like in that space when you're coming into contact with people from different parts and different schools.
Yeah, I think the first things that we did as when we started Kinetic, or when I got involved into Kinetic, was just getting to know each other and realizing that we all had very like a vast different experiences, and that everyone's experiences really had an impact in how they viewed things, and that they were all important. And so I think with the help of our youth leader, those like the first few weeks that we knew each other was very much of, we have all these different experiences, we have learned all these different things from our different walks of lives, of having gone to different schools, and that they're all they're all necessary, and they all build a like our idea of what needs to be changed.
Mm, that's interesting. And then could you then tell me about kind of how your your experience in this group um is kind of influenced your politics and just generally like how you approach your neighborhood and community members in the city in general.
Yeah, I think it's affected how I even view things to begin with. Like, I think before I did organizing, the way I viewed things was very much on a surface level outlook. But as I got more into my organizing, I was able to see it through the lens of organizing to begin with, where it was just like, okay, this is like a certain narrative that we have, but how does this affect other people? How does this affect my community? And is this something that brings like a positive effect to everyone, or does it have like a heavily like negative impact on a certain group of people? And I think that was like the biggest change, whether it had to do with politics or it had to just do with like community in general. That was like the biggest shift that I had. Um, and I think like in terms of just being a part of my community, I was a lot more comfortable in my community. I felt like I was really a part of my community because I felt like I was representing a lot more people, and I was really pushing for what we wanted to see changes in our community. And I became a lot more aware of what my community wanted to represent itself as and what it needed.
Mm. So when you say community in this instance, are you talking about your school community, um, fellow organizers in Kinetic, or your neighborhood, just to get more clarity on that?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think when I talk about community, it's really centered on, like, let's say uptown neighborhood that had a lot to do with people's budget, because I was working directly with uptown constituents in trying to get their voices heard. But also when I'm in my school community, as a student representative, I'm talking to students and seeing the changes that they want to see or the problems they have with our school. So in that space, I'm talking about my community, but also with Kinetic is we're all working together, and we're learning more about our community as Chicago overall, but also our schools, and just like even our immigrant refugee communities as well.
Mm. So in your work, learning more about and feeling more connected to, let's say, your school community, in that specific context, what was something that was surprising to you or was a challenge that you faced?
Your audio cut out. I can't hear.
So with when you were making these changes and in the specific context of your school community, what were certain things that you found to be surprising?
I think the biggest surprise was like the disparities between how students were getting treated. Um, it was especially like when we were working in SVC, one of the biggest goals that we had was the racial differences that we saw in our schools, or the lack of disciplinary actions that were taking place, especially when students were like going around saying derogatory terms to students' faces themselves. It was very much, I felt like our administration was turning a blind eye to this. And I think that was like the biggest surprise I had. This happened like freshman year. And it felt like something that you would think administration get involved in, and the students are like, talked to, and you would think that there was a disciplinary action. But um, it very much felt like administration turned a blind eye to this, and oftentimes it was very much like the students that were affected that were the ones getting impacted, or more so like, like pushback in their reaction, where it felt like administration was kind of turning the blame onto the students themselves. There was like a time where a student like expressed not feeling safe in the environment after saying something derogatory, and like students were very angered by this, and it turned to like the school protecting that student and being like, the student doesn't feel safe, and it kind of fell on like black students, like it was just like, oh, you guys are causing these issues, and it oftentimes it turns into like blaming those students. So I think that was the biggest shock that I faced in working in these places and spaces.
So what was the experience then in SVC? Was it to advocate for students who are victims of are they racial slurs and hate crimes or
Yeah, I think SVC in itself was to change the school environment, whether it was advocating for these students who were, having slurs like thrown at them, or there were students that were making group chats that were extremely racist, or it was like students that were getting bullied for their identities. So I think SVC was really a place to make the school more safe for them, but also at the same time to push administration to impact discipline for these actions. And really, I think the Northside culture became students could push the boundaries of these things, and they knew that they weren't getting disciplined or there weren't repercussions for their actions. So I think SVC was really just trying to push administration to implement this, but at the same time creating a more safer and a well-rounded environment for the students that were affected.
Mm. So you talk about kind of a disparity in discipline, and Black students oftentimes facing blame. Do you have a personal experience or an experience that relates to that dynamic in your school community?
Yeah, I think when I talked about earlier that the like almost the role that you would assume SROs had shifted onto security, that came with like backpack checkings or having to walk through metal detectors in the morning. And I think it felt very much because it was a random pick of students, me and my cousin who are both go to the school. It felt like a lot more students who were minorities were, or like Black students were picked out more for these searches, where it was just like really the security, whoever he felt like choosing was searched. And on multiple occasions, my bag has been searched. I think almost like in a span of like 2 weeks, my bag has been searched more than 4 or 5 times when I know students whose bags have never been searched. So I think those were like the small things that we were noticing. I think there was a time too that we were chased by a security guard in a car while we were trying to leave the school. And this was like around the end of the school year where a lot of students had already left the school, and we decided that we wanted to leave also. But we were chased down a sidewalk by our school by the security guard in his car. It was a very awkward, but like also just concerning event where it was just like, why are we being followed outside of the school when majority of the school population has already left? And teachers, it wasn't like a school session, like we weren't learning. It was really students were there until the end of the school day, and it was a very awkward situation to be put on, and it felt awkward because it was 3 Black students that were trying to leave the school, and us knowing that the whole school population had basically left, and we were the ones being chased down for leaving early.
Mm, that's a very troubling experience to have had. I'm curious, do you think that school administrators or people in security recognize you to be like a student organizer in any sense? Because I'm curious about how it feels to be involved with SVC, your local school council, and want to make a difference in that space, but it also being a place where you keep experiencing these types of um, practices.
Yeah, I think in terms of like knowing that I am an organizer, I feel like my teachers are a lot more aware of that and a lot more supportive of that. Um, I think, like I mentioned, SVC is led by 2 teachers who wanted to create the space for the students. So those two teachers like very much know my experiences and my dedication to such work outside of school. And they're very much the ones that promote this type of environment in our school. So I think for me, teachers are the ones that are overwhelmingly more aware of like what students are doing and what students want to push. And the real disconnect that I feel is between administration and the students, where there's not really like an understanding of this is what students are doing and this is what we want to see and this is what administration is doing. So I think in my work with LSC, I think my principal is more aware now of the work that I do outside because I am in like a small space working closely with her. But in the two like principals that we've had in our 4 years, I don't think they're well aware of the work that I'm trying to push for or like, the different perspectives that we have when it comes to certain things that we're pushing. It's very much just like, oh, these are what students want, but they aren't able to provide it. And I don't think administration is able to look at us outside the lens of just what we're doing in our schools.
Mm, that's very interesting. Do you think that that relationship is similar with maybe your leaders in the neighborhood, like older people and politicians? Um, because I'm curious of like what kinds of surprises that also existed in doing work within those communities.
Yeah, I think this comes with like always with youth organizing is a lot of students aren't a lot of youth are overlooked in their work as youth organizers. And I think that comes from just even community members. I think there have been so many times where reaching out to community members, they've, when we're like calling community members to be like, can we push for this action? It's very much like, oh, you guys are little, like you guys are youth. How can you implement this? So I think those were like the initial surprises that were coming. But the biggest one was when you're very much involved in an organization and you're pushing for something, but our representatives themselves are overlooking our impact or don't even want to interact with us in pushing for something that their constituents want. A personal narrative that I have is when we were working with the people's budget and trying to get like our aldermen to listen to our concerns. It was very much a back and forth, trying to just get him to listen to our ideas or just try to get to know us and what we think our community members were. It was a wide range of like emails that we were sending over a span of like 3 weeks, asking if we could have a meeting with him or if we could just like get him to respond to our emails. And obviously our emails weren't responded directly from him. It was very much someone else in his office that was responding to us, being like, oh, the alderman is busy. He like appreciates your concerns. And it was very much like a surface level answer until we kept like putting pressure and pressure where we were eventually given like a 15-minute conversation with him. Um, and those are difficult because it's over Zoom. We're trying to get all our concerns on there, but you're given 15 minutes to give your entire perspective on a budget and how we think he could better represent thousands of constituents. And it just really didn't make sense because your job is to work for constituents, but you don't even have the time to speak to your constituents. So I think that was what troubled us the most and what was the most surprising. It was my very first interaction with a person in like politics or someone that, should be representing us. It was just eye-opening to realize this dynamic doesn't work correctly because this is not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be someone that's very much involved in the community. And it was surprising to me to like not know who my alderman was before this. And that just says so much about the amount of people that really don't know who their alderman is or what they do or how they're even supposed to represent them. I think that was like my biggest surprise in terms of working in Uptown, my neighborhood, and like trying to get aldermen to like do the things we wanted him to do.
Mm. So with that budget, with the budget that got passed after you guys worked with this budget and it not looking the way that, organizers and community members wanted to look like, I'm curious moving forward, how you think the change is gonna, how do you think the change is gonna be made when it comes to defunding the police or putting more resources towards what you said, like affordable housing and stuff.
Yeah, I think even like I said before, after the budget was passed, we very much still tried to keep in contact with the alderman and show the pressure that we had, or that the pressure there was on him to change. And sadly, it was very much not represented. It wasn't reflected. We couldn't get a hold of the alderman after that. And I think for me, that's one of the biggest changes that has to come is we need aldermen, or we need representatives that are very much willing to work within the community. They're willing to be a part of the community and listen to their constituents, because ultimately, if they can't have that connection, really there isn't much that can go on when they're in their private meetings or they're having their voting with the mayor. And I think also the dynamic between mayors and aldermen is very, it's concerning to see, because the budget is something the mayor makes, and the aldermen have to vote on her budget, or they have to come up with a new budget that they think is more representative. And I think that's very difficult when there's a different dynamic of power between aldermen and the mayor. And I think that just doesn't allow for the process to work as fluidly and as positively as it should for everyone around, and everyone in the communities.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your perspective and the impact that, doing this organizing work has on your thoughts, your politics, and your commitments. I guess I'm curious, like, just before we wrap up the interview, what would you kind of like to say to current and future Chicago youth who are mobilizing their communities and trying to make the difference that you articulated in Georgia and educational equity?
I think something that my youth leader said to me earlier was, it's gonna take so long for you to feel comfortable in getting your voice out there, or to feel comfortable in like being able to express your ideas and to challenge authority. And I struggled a lot with that at the very beginning. And I think that my biggest like advice is to really just be comfortable in that, like in that feeling of uncomfortableness, because eventually once you get over it, the changes that you will be able to bring, or just like within yourself too, the changes you'll see in your understanding of how things work is very fulfilling. And I think working as a youth organizer had allowed me to see so many things in different perspectives, and it's really just very fulfilling to be able to be a part of.
Mm. How do you think that all of this work impacts your current and future work? You're soon to be a graduate, a high school graduate, and still the budget looks the way that it used to look a few years back. The Mayor Lightfoot is opening up a cop academy that youth have been protesting against for years. So I'm curious how you maintain hope and how you see all of your past work informing your future.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing about youth organizing is I've realized it's something that will continue to be a part of my life. Something, it's almost like a dedication that I've made to do for the rest of my life. And it's not something that I see stopping once I'm no longer part of the youth group. It's very much something that I'll keep pushing for, regardless of where I am. And specific to Chicago, I think it would be amazing to be able to come back as as someone who could just like push youth to be a part of this, and someone who can advocate for youth in schools or in their communities or in their neighborhoods, to really get up there and get their voices heard. And even though I may not stay a youth organizer forever, I think it would mean a lot to be able to push other youth to do that as well, and to let their voices heard and find themselves within organizing.
Mm. Do you think that currently there's that work being done around like the cop academy that is being opened up, or other, cases of police brutality that we hear about almost on a daily basis? Do you think that that work is being done, and do you see kind of contributing to that work moving forward or not?
Oh, for sure. I think I definitely want to find a way to be a part of that outside of just as a youth organizer. There's something that's interesting about the organization that I was working with is they have a youth organizing group, but they do have an adult version of that, where it's a lot of people from all around the city that are concerned about a lot of narratives that has to do with cops at CPS or the cop academy that's been built, or just the budget in general, or just how certain things work in the communities that they live in. So there is very much those spaces all around Chicago, and in these organizations, they have both a youth and an adult version of all of those. So I think those are spaces that I'll definitely be putting myself into. Um, and I think there's always more work to be done. It's organizing is never something that's just done once an act passes or when an organization is made. And I think that's work that we have to keep pushing. And when I was talking about, like getting more youth involved is you can never have too many youth involved. If we could have all youth involved in this work, it would really be something that so many people can push forward and really ask for, and that obviously always impacts our organizing for the better.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm just gonna ask a few demographic questions. What racial and or ethnic identity would you identify with?
I am African or African American.
What is your gender identity?
I am a cisgendered woman.
Were you eligible for free and reduced lunch programs growing up?
Yes, I was.
What level of education did your parents complete?
My parents separately have, my mom has completed a high school diploma, and my dad has completed his bachelor's.
What levels, oh, what kinds of responsibilities did you have after school?
I am involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. We do have a lot of student-led organizations in our school. And then outside of just school in general, I did have jobs all through high school. And on top of that, I do take care of my little sister whenever my parents need to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meron, for taking time today and for sharing your story. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.